Valerie Ashford didn't believe in fate. And she sure as hell didn't believe the universe had any interest in a 27-year-old flower delivery girl who couldn't even keep her electricity on for a full month. She'd been cutting rose thorns since 6 that morning, her fingers marked with tiny scars that no one ever noticed, loading arrangements into a van that smelled like wet petals and gasoline, racing across Chicago to make rich people's tables look beautiful, while her own kitchen table held nothing but a stack of overdue hospital bills, $47,000 worth of debt from the cancer that took her mother and the father who'd walked out when Val was 11, leaving her to hold her mom's hand in a county hospital at 22 when the diagnosis came, and bury her at 25 with borrowed money she still couldn't pay back. So when the last-minute order came in that evening, a white funeral wreath, delivered to Monarch Memorial Chapel in Gold Coast before 7, double tip, she didn't ask questions. She just drove, because questions didn't pay rent, and curiosity didn't settle collection calls. But here's the thing about wrong doors. You don't know they're wrong until they've already closed behind you. The man at the side entrance pointed her toward the main hall, and Val walked in carrying $300 worth of white lilies into a room that didn't match her order slip. A room where the air wasn't thick with grief but with power, where men in tailored black suits stood like sentinels rather than mourners, where a dark mahogany casket sat closed beneath a portrait of a handsome younger man, and where absolutely no one was crying. She realized the mistake in the same second she realized she couldn't leave the hallway behind her was blocked. The main doors were flanked by men whose eyes tracked her like she'd already done something wrong, and the only way out was a service corridor she'd spotted near the back. That corridor is where Valerie Ashford's old life ended. She heard 2 voices behind a door left slightly open, one calm, one nervous, and the calm voice said 7 words that would rearrange everything. "There's nothing in that casket to see." Val's blood went cold. Her hand knocked a candle stand, and when that door swung open and a silver-haired man stared straight at her, she ran through the hallway, through the mourners, out the front doors, and crashed directly into a man walking up the steps. He caught her arm, not rough but absolute, and she looked up into a face that didn't ask permission to be feared. Gray eyes, a jaw cut like a warning, and the kind of stillness that only belongs to someone who's decided long ago that the world bends to him, not the other way around. His name was Corbin Falcone. He was 37 years old. He ran an empire that lived in the dark behind a clean corporate smile. And tonight, he'd come to bury his younger brother except, as the terrified flower girl, with $43 in her wallet and blood-red thorn scars on her fingers, was about to tell him there might not be a brother to bury at all. If this story already has your heart racing, do yourself a favor. Smash that like button, share this with someone who loves a good thriller, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the moment Valerie looked into Corbin Falcone's eyes and everything changed. Corbin Falcone didn't let go right away. His fingers stayed wrapped around her arm, not squeezing, not hurting, but holding her in place the way someone holds a door they haven't decided to open or shut. Val's breath came in short, ragged pulls, her chest rising and falling too fast, and she could feel the wreath she'd been carrying now crushed between them, white petals falling onto the stone steps, like something dying in slow motion. He looked at her the way a man reads a contract before signing, scanning every detail, measuring every risk, and his voice came out low, almost casual, as if he weren't standing on the steps of his brother's funeral, asking a stranger why she'd just sprinted out of the building like the walls were on fire. "You're shaking," he said. And it wasn't concern, it was observation, the kind a predator makes before deciding whether something is prey or irrelevant. Val opened her mouth to answer, but the words jammed somewhere between her throat and her pride, and before she could force anything out, a voice came from behind Corbin, smooth and measured, the voice of a man who'd spent decades choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses incisions. Paxton Greer stepped into the doorway, 52 years old, silver hair combed back like polished steel, a face that had learned long ago how to wear calm the way other men wore cologne. "Just a delivery mix-up," Paxton said, and his tone was perfect, warm enough to sound reasonable, cool enough to close the conversation. The flower girl wandered into the wrong room. "It's handled." Val watched Paxton's hands as he spoke. His voice didn't betray him. His posture didn't betray him. But his right hand, the one resting against his chest, kept pressing the lapel of his vest, smoothing it down, pressing again, a rhythm that had nothing to do with wrinkles, and everything to do with a heartbeat he couldn't quite control. She'd seen that gesture before. in the county hospital waiting room, on her own mother's doctor, the night he came out to say the tumor had spread, but stood there, straightening his coat for 10 seconds before he could get the words out. People who were telling the truth didn't need to hold themselves together. Paxton Greer was holding himself together. Corbin glanced back at Paxton for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, then turned to Val again. Something shifted behind those gray eyes, something she couldn't name but could feel, like the temperature dropping a single degree before a storm that hasn't arrived yet. Then he released her arm. Not suddenly, not gently, just released, the way you set down something you've decided to pick up later. Go, he said. One word, no explanation. Val didn't need to be told twice. She turned, crossed the parking lot in strides that wanted to be sprints but forced themselves into walks, because running would mean admitting she had a reason to run, and she climbed into the van with hands that couldn't find the ignition on the first try or the second. The engine coughed alive and she pulled out of the lot, past the black sedans lined up like a funeral procession that hadn't started moving yet, past the men in suits who watched her van, the way wolves watch a rabbit deciding which direction to flee. She made it 2 blocks before she checked the rearview mirror. Corbin Falcone was still standing on the steps. He hadn't moved. He hadn't gone inside to mourn his brother. He stood exactly where she'd left him, hands in his pockets, watching her van disappear down the Gold Coast street. And even from 2 blocks away, even through a dirty mirror in a van that smelled like crushed lilies and fear, Val could feel his eyes on her like a hand that hadn't quite let go. She drove faster. She didn't stop until Pilsen, until the streets turned familiar and small, and cracked in the places she recognized, until the Gold Coast was just a glow in the mirror behind her, and even then her hands wouldn't stop trembling against the wheel. Back on the steps, Corbin pulled out his phone. He didn't go inside. He didn't join the mourners. He called one number, the only number he called when something didn't sit right, and Trent Braddock picked up on the first ring the way he always did, because men who worked for Corbin Falcone learned early that a second ring was 1 ring too many. The flower van, Corbin said, his voice flat, stripped of everything except instruction. License plate. The shop's name, the girl's name, her address, her schedule, who she talks to, where she sleeps, everything. Trent didn't ask why. He never asked why. He just said, "How fast?" And Corbin looked down at the crushed white petals on the steps where a terrified girl had stood seconds ago, petals that looked less like flowers and more like evidence, and said, "Before sunrise." Corbin put his phone away, stared at the crushed petals on the steps for one more breath, then walked into Monarch Memorial Chapel, as though nothing had just happened outside. He had spent his entire life training that face, the face that showed no one anything except what he chose to reveal. And tonight, he chose to reveal a brother who had come to say goodbye to his younger brother, nothing more and nothing less. The main funeral room was quieter than he had expected. There was no loud crying, no helpless sobbing out of control, only the kind of silence that belonged to rooms where people were more afraid than grieving. More than 40 people sat on rows of dark wooden pews, most of them men from the Falcone family, or allied families who had come to pay their respects. And they sat with their backs straight, eyes forward, hands resting on their laps, looking more like people attending a meeting than a funeral. Corbin walked down the center aisle, each footstep echoing across the marble floor, and he could feel every pair of eyes fixed on his back. But no one dared look directly at him when he turned. He stopped in front of the coffin. Dark mahogany, polished so deeply that he could see the blurred reflection of his own face on its surface, and that moment felt stranger than he had prepared himself for, because he was looking down at the thing that was supposed to contain his younger brother, and the only feeling he had wasn't pain, but suspicion. He hated that feeling. He wanted to hurt. He wanted to stand here and feel the heart-tearing loss of a brother who had lost his brother. But something stopped the pain from reaching him, like a pane of glass standing between him and his emotions, and that glass had the shape of the 7 words the flower delivery girl had heard behind the half-open door. Paxton stood on the right side of the coffin, less than a step away, hands folded in front of his stomach, head slightly bowed, the posture of a man in mourning. But Corbin noticed it. Paxton wasn't looking at Finch's photograph on the stand above. He was looking at the coffin. More precisely, he was looking at the coffin lid, and the distance between him and it was too close for an advisor, too watchful for a man grieving. Corbin recorded that without letting even half a line of his face change. In the 3rd row on the left, Orla Kinney sat with a handkerchief pressed to her eyes, her shoulders trembling lightly with a steady rhythm of crying. 29 years old, dark brown hair falling loose over her shoulders, a black dress expensive enough to belong to this world, and she cried the right way, in the right measure, with exactly the kind of tears a soon-to-be bride should shed before the coffin of the man she was meant to marry. But in the moment Corbin turned and looked toward the right side of the room, he caught it. Orla lowered the handkerchief for exactly 1 second, and her eyes weren't on the coffin, weren't on Finch's photograph, but flicked toward Paxton Greer, quick, sharp, the kind of glance that two strangers never shared, and two people hiding something always did. Then the handkerchief rose again, her shoulders trembled again, and Orla went on crying as though that moment had never existed. Corbin turned back toward the front. In the first row, directly in the center, Monique Falcone sat motionless, 63 years old, her back straight as iron, her silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, the rosary wrapped around the fingers of her left hand squeezed so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, staring straight ahead, not at the coffin, not at her son's photograph, but into empty space, as though she were looking at something no one else in the room could see. Corbin knew his mother. She wasn't a woman who didn't know how to cry. She was a woman who chose when to cry, and tonight she chose not to cry, and that could mean she was in too much pain to cry, or it could mean she didn't feel pain in the way a mother who had lost her child should feel it. Corbin stepped beside the coffin, placed his hand on the wooden lid, and spoke loudly enough for Paxton to hear. "Open it. I want to see my brother's face." The sentence dropped into the room like a stone falling into still water. Paxton reacted quickly, stepping forward half a step, his voice low, careful. "Corbin, don't torture yourself." The car explosion. His face isn't recognizable anymore. The funeral home advised keeping the coffin closed. Remember Finch the way he was when he was alive. Corbin didn't look at Paxton. He looked down at his own hand resting on the coffin lid, at his fingers touching the polished wood, and he counted. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. 3 seconds of silence that Paxton had to endure without knowing what Corbin was thinking. And Corbin knew those 3 seconds were eating Paxton from the inside, because he had used this technique his whole life. Silence was the weapon powerful men used to make other people expose themselves. Then he lifted his hand from the coffin, nodded once, and said, "Fine. Just one word." Paxton let out a breath. Faint, almost impossible to hear, but Corbin heard it. He turned away and walked to the front row, sat down beside Monique, and while everyone in the room thought Corbin Falcone had accepted it, he was fitting the pieces together. Paxton standing too close to the coffin, Orla glancing at Paxton, Monique not crying, the coffin lid needing to stay sealed, and the flower delivery girl running out of the building as though she had just heard something no one was ever supposed to hear. He didn't know the truth yet, but he knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that something was wrong in this room, and the girl with the rose-thorn scars on her fingers knew what it was. Val didn't remember how she drove back to Pilsen. She only remembered her hands on the steering wheel, the streetlights smearing across the windshield, and the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears louder than the van's engine. When she parked in the alley behind the old apartment building on 18th Street, she sat there for another 5 minutes in the dark, trying to force herself to believe that what she had heard at the Monarch funeral home wasn't real, that she had misunderstood, that the voice behind the half-open door had been talking about something else, and not an empty coffin. But she hadn't misunderstood. She knew she hadn't misunderstood, and that was exactly what frightened her more than anything. Val's studio was on the 3rd floor, with no elevator, only a concrete stairwell with an iron railing whose paint had been peeling long before she moved in. She locked the door, slid the extra safety bolt she had bought herself at the hardware store for $9, then sat down on the floor, her back against the door, her knees drawn up to her chest. The room around her was so small she could see everything without turning her head. The single bed pressed against the wall, the tiny kitchen with 2 burners and only one that still worked, the sink with a dripping faucet she couldn't afford to call a plumber to fix, and on the kitchen table, the envelope from the debt collection company lying beside 2 packages of instant noodles and a banana that had already begun to bruise. That was the life of Valerie Ashford, 27 years old. By day, she cut flowers, trimmed stems, and delivered orders for Gwen Pratt's shop, earning $14 an hour with no insurance. By night, she served drinks at a bar in Logan Square, making extra tip money from men drinking beer, men she had to smile at even when she didn't want to smile. Every Monday, her phone rang, and on the other end was the polite but cold voice of an employee from the debt collection company, reminding her that $47,000 in hospital bills didn't disappear on its own, that interest was still running, that they might have to proceed with the next steps if she didn't arrange payment. She always answered the same way, "I'm trying. I'll send it when I can," then hung up and sat there staring at her hands, at the fingers marked with rose-thorn scars, wondering whether her mother had ever imagined that her death would follow her daughter in the form of weekly debt collection calls. Sitting on the floor tonight, Val thought of her mother. Not her mother in the county hospital bed with an IV needle taped into her hand, but her mother before that, her mother healthy, standing in the kitchen of their old apartment in Humboldt Park when Val was little, making soup out of whatever was left in the refrigerator, and saying things Val hadn't understood back then, but now understood down to every word. "Don't ever get tangled up in rich people's business, Val. They don't play by the same rules we do. When they lose money. When we lose our lives." Val hugged her knees tighter and thought that her mother had been right. Her mother had always been right, and tonight she had stepped into the very world her mother had warned her about. A world of black cars, black suits, sealed coffins, and secrets ordinary people weren't allowed to know. She told herself she would forget it. She would wake up tomorrow morning, go to Gwen's flower shop, strip thorns from roses the way she did every day, and pretend tonight had never happened. She almost believed she could do that. Then the lock clicked. Not a knock, not a doorbell. The lock, her $9 safety bolt, snapped cleanly as if it were a matchstick, and the door opened with the deliberate silence only people used to breaking into rooms knew how to create. Trent Braddock entered first, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorframe, his eyes sweeping the room in less than 2 seconds with the habit of a man who had spent his whole life entering rooms before his boss did. Then Corbin Falcone crossed the threshold, and Val's studio suddenly seemed half its size. He was so tall he had to tilt his head slightly to avoid the low-hanging ceiling light, the cheap fixture with the yellow plastic shade Val had always meant to replace but never had. And his presence in this room was so wrong it was almost absurd, like putting a wolf inside a shoebox. His black suit probably cost more than everything Val owned put together, and he stood in the middle of the room looking around. Not to search, but to measure, measuring her life with one glance, the noodle packets on the table, the debt collection envelope, the dripping faucet, the single bed with its faded sheets, and Val hated that she felt ashamed, hated that his presence forced her to see her own life through the eyes of someone who had never had to count every dollar. "What did you hear?" He didn't say hello. He didn't explain how he had gotten in, or how he had found her. He asked as if she had already known he would come, and maybe, somewhere in the most lucid part of herself, she had known. Val stood up from the floor, not because she was brave, but because she refused to sit on the ground in her own home in front of anyone. "I didn't hear anything," she said, her voice steadier than she thought it could be, her eyes fixed straight on him. "I delivered the wrong flowers. I panicked. I ran. That's all." Corbin tilted his head to one side. Only a few degrees. The tilt of a man listening not to the words, but to the breathing, to the spaces between the words, to everything left unsaid. He stayed silent long enough for Val to feel every second dragging across her skin. Then he spoke, his voice low, not angry, almost respectful. "You lie better than most people I know, but not better than me." And Val realized, standing in her tiny studio at 2 o'clock in the morning with the Mafia boss of Chicago, less than 3 steps away from her, that her mother's warning hadn't only been right, it hadn't been enough. Her mother had told her not to get tangled up in rich people's business. Her mother hadn't told her what to do when rich people's business came looking for her at her own front door at 2 o'clock in the morning and stood beneath a cheap light bulb, waiting for her to confess. Silence filled the studio like water rising in a sealed room. Val stood against the wall. Corbin stood in the middle of the room, and the distance between them was less than 3 steps. But it held everything neither of them was ready to say. Val looked at him, looked closely. Not because she wanted to, but because she was searching for a reason to keep lying. But what she saw wasn't a Mafia boss who had come to threaten a flower delivery girl. What she saw was the tendon in his neck tightening every time he swallowed, the way he stood too straight, as if allowing his back to bend even a single inch would make his whole body break. The gray eyes beneath that cold surface holding something she recognized instantly because she had seen it in the mirror for the past 2 years. Pain. Not the kind of pain that screamed or smashed things. The kind of pain that belonged to someone holding everything inside because there was no one safe enough to fall apart in front of. She had seen that kind of pain on the doctor's face at Cook County Hospital the night he stepped into the hallway and told her that her mother would be all right. His voice warm and steady and completely false. And Val had known he was lying because his eyes didn't match his mouth. And 2 weeks later, her mother died on a public hospital bed, while the monitor gave one long beep and never made another sound. Corbin Falcone tonight looked like that doctor from that night. A man holding a truth he didn't know yet, but his body had already felt, and he was standing in front of her, waiting for her to confirm what his instincts had been telling him since the moment he placed his hand on the coffin lid and felt nothing. Val looked down at her hands, at the rose-thorn scars, the new cuts laid over old ones, the hands of someone who worked 14 hours a day to pay down a debt that never got smaller, and she understood that these hands didn't belong to the world she was about to step into with her next words. But she also understood that lying to a man in pain about the death of his younger brother was a kind of cruelty she didn't have in her, because she knew what it felt like to be lied to while someone you loved was dying. So she spoke. I heard 2 people talking behind the door in the side hallway. One voice was calm. One voice was worried. The calm one said the coffin had to stay closed. No one was allowed to open it, especially you. The other asked what would happen if you demanded to see your brother's face one last time. And the calm one said. She stopped, not because she had forgotten, but because she knew the next 7 words would change everything, for her and for the man standing in front of her. There's nothing in that casket to see. Corbin didn't move. He didn't frown, didn't clench his jaw, didn't ball his hand into a fist, didn't breathe harder. He stood completely still, and that stillness was more frightening than any reaction, because it wasn't calm. It was the moment before a building collapsed, when the structure had already broken but gravity hadn't yet had time to pull it down. Inside Corbin, the world he had built over more than 20 years, was shifting on its foundation. Paxton Greer, 52 years old, the man his father had called a brother, the man who had sat beside his father's bed on the final night and promised to hold the Falcone family together until Corbin was hard enough to take the wheel, the man who had taught him how to read people, how to hold power, how to turn fear into loyalty. That man had stood beside an empty coffin and watched him grieve without blinking. He said nothing for 10 seconds. 10 seconds that Val counted by the drip of the leaking faucet in the sink. Then he spoke, his voice flat, not shaking, not raised, like a man reading a sentence that had already been written. The calm voice, gray hair, black suit, peaked lapels. Right? Val nodded. Corbin looked at Trent. Trent looked back. No one needed to say Paxton's name. Corbin turned back to Val, and this time his eyes were different, no longer reading her, but calculating, placing her into an equation she had never wanted to be part of. The man you heard speaking was Paxton Greer. He's my family's advisor. He knows every face, every name, every car that went in and out of the funeral home tonight. He saw your face. He saw you run. And now he knows you heard something he didn't want anyone to hear. He paused, letting the weight of each word fall exactly where it belonged. Paxton will want you dead. Not want in the angry way. Want in the necessary way. You're the only crack in whatever he's hiding, and men like Paxton don't let cracks exist. Val felt the floor beneath her feet tilt, even though it hadn't moved at all. I don't want to be involved in this, she said, and for the first time that night, her voice lost its steadiness, breaking at the edge of the last word like torn paper. I don't know your family. I don't know Paxton. I just deliver flowers. I just need to pay my debt and get through the day. I don't want to be involved. Corbin looked at her, and in his eyes there was something almost like regret, not for himself, but for her, because he knew the answer he was about to give would take away the life she had, even if that life held nothing but instant noodles and bills. You're already involved, he said, from the moment you walked through the wrong door. And before Val could object, before she could say she had the right to stay in her own home, Trent had opened the door, and Corbin had turned his back and stepped out, and the only sentence he left behind before disappearing into the dark hallway was, "Take anything you need. You won't be coming back here for a while." Val stood in the middle of the studio, looking around at the 4 walls she hated but that were hers, looking at the debt collection envelope on the kitchen table, looking at the noodle packets, looking at the single bed, and she realized that her mother had been wrong about one thing. Her mother had told her not to get tangled up in rich people's business, but sometimes rich people's business didn't need her to get tangled up in it. It only needed her to walk through the wrong door, and after that, the rest was no longer a choice. She stuffed her wallet, her phone, and a change of clothes into her old backpack, turned off the light, and walked out of the studio on 18th Street in Pilsen, not knowing that it would be the last time she left that room as the old Valerie Ashford. The private elevator carried them up to the highest floor of Falcone Tower without stopping at any level, the kind of elevator that required a key card and a passcode, the kind Val had never seen in real life, and when the doors opened, she stepped into a world she understood at once did not belong to her. The penthouse spread out before her like a statement that didn't need to be spoken. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls looking out over Lake Michigan, black and heavy beneath the night sky, ash-gray marble cold beneath the soles of her shoes, minimalist furniture with straight lines sharp as knife cuts, not one family photograph on the wall, not one open book on a table, not one coat thrown over a chair, not one sign that anyone truly lived here instead of merely existing. The penthouse was beautiful, the way a blade was beautiful, sharp and cold and perfect, and entirely uninterested in comforting anyone. Val set her old backpack down on the marble floor, and the sound it made seemed so out of place it was almost offensive. Faded fabric against polished stone, her life placed in the middle of his. Trent led her down the hallway to a guest bedroom, a room larger than her entire studio in Pilsen, with a double bed dressed in spotless white sheets, a closet already stocked with new clothes, towels folded neatly in the private bathroom, beside a sink carved from a single slab of stone. She opened the closet and saw shirts, pants, shoes, all in her size, and that made her shiver more than it made her grateful, because it meant someone had found out her measurements in the time between her leaving Pilsen and arriving here, and that kind of efficiency did not belong to the normal world. Corbin did not give her a tour. He stood in the living room, his back to her, looking out at Lake Michigan through the glass wall, and spoke without turning around. "You have your own room. There's food in the kitchen. Anything you need, tell Trent. But you don't leave the building, and you don't call anyone." Val placed her hand on the bedroom doorframe and felt anger rise in her. Not the explosive kind, but the slow kind, the kind of anger that belonged to someone used to being backed into corners by life, but who had never agreed to stay there quietly. "I have a night shift at the bar. If I don't show up, I lose my job. If I lose my job, no one pays this month's rent. And Gwen, the flower shop owner, is expecting me tomorrow morning. She only has me. If I don't show up and don't say anything, she'll call the police." Corbin turned around, and his eyes weren't angry, weren't irritated, only filled with the cold patience of a man who had heard every argument there was to hear, and still knew the answer had not changed. "Your life ends in 24 hours if you walk out of this building. The bar will find someone else. The rent will be late. Gwen will worry. But you'll be alive. Do you want to be alive, or do you want to be on time?" Val didn't answer because she had no answer that wouldn't admit he was right. And admitting he was right meant accepting that her life, with $43 in her wallet, now sat in the hands of a man she knew nothing about, except his name and the way he had held her arm on the steps. She turned into the room and closed the door, not slamming it, because slamming a door was the reaction of someone who still hoped to change the situation, and Val knew she couldn't change anything tonight. She sat on the bed, her back against the headboard, and did what she always did when everything slipped beyond her control. She opened her wallet. Inside were $43, 2 $20 bills, and 3 $1 bills, arranged from largest to smallest, corners straight, edges flat, the way her mother had taught her when she was 12 years old. "Always know how much you have, Val. Count before you sleep. Count when you wake up. People can take your money, but they can't take your habits." She counted. 20, 40, 50, no, 43. She knew it was 43 before she counted. She always knew. But she counted anyway, because the act of counting kept her on the ground, kept her in reality, reminded her that even though she was sitting on a bed more expensive than everything she owned in the penthouse of Chicago's Mafia boss, she was still Valerie Ashford, the flower delivery girl with $43, and those $43 were the only thing in this room that truly belonged to her. Out in the hallway, Corbin walked toward his room. He passed hers, the door left slightly ajar, and he did not mean to look in. But the desk lamp spilling through the narrow gap pulled his eyes by instinct. He saw her sitting on the bed, legs drawn up, head bowed, holding a few wrinkled bills in her hands, counting them slowly, one by one, with the focus of someone performing a ritual rather than checking a balance. Corbin stopped. not because he wanted to watch her, but because the sight struck him in a place where he had no defense, somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than calculation, where a living memory remained, one he had spent 15 years trying to bury. He was 14 years old, a 2-room apartment in Bridgeport, before his father found him, before the Falcone family pulled him in, when he was still the son of a single mother who worked 2 shifts at the meatpacking plant on Ashland Avenue. He sat on the bed, counting the money his mother kept in a tin box on top of the refrigerator, counting to see whether there was enough for milk and bread, or whether they had to choose one or the other. And he counted in exactly the same way Val was counting, slowly, carefully, as if every bill were a fragile promise between living and not being able to survive. His father came looking for him when he was 15, took him out of the Bridgeport apartment, out of his mother's life, placed him into a world where money no longer needed to be counted because it never ran out, but also took from him everything money couldn't buy. He had not counted money since then. He didn't need to count. But tonight, standing outside the half-closed door, watching the flower delivery girl count $43 on a $2,000 bed inside his penthouse, Corbin Falcone remembered the feeling of each bill between his 14-year-old fingers, and he realized he had not forgotten. He had only pretended to forget. He said nothing. He kept walking, entered his own room, closed the door, sat in the dark looking out at the black water of Lake Michigan, and the girl counting money in the room beside his clung to his mind in a way no logic could explain, and no whiskey could wash away. The next morning, Corbin left the penthouse before the sky had fully brightened, leaving Val in the apartment with Trent guarding the door and the silence of a place too large for one person. He didn't say where he was going, and Val didn't ask, because she had begun to understand that in Corbin Falcone's world, questions were a luxury people without power weren't allowed to buy. Corbin drove to an industrial warehouse in back of the yards, where one of his men, named Wes, a forensic specialist the Falcone family, had kept off the books for more than 10 years, had spent the entire night analyzing the car explosion files again, the explosion that had supposedly killed Finch. Wes laid 4 scene photographs on the steel table. Beside them, 3 DNA reports that the Chicago police had stamped as completed, and spoke to Corbin in the voice of a man used to delivering bad news. The DNA collected from debris inside the car matched Finch Falcone's profile by 87%. Enough for the police to close the file, but not enough for Wes, and the dental sample used to confirm the identity had come from the family dentist. But that dental record showed signs of being accessed and altered 3 days before the explosion, meaning someone had entered the dentist's system and changed the data before the death happened. Corbin looked at the photographs, looked at the numbers, and he wasn't surprised. He only felt the final piece of suspicion fall into place, soft as the sound of a gun being cocked. He told Wes to keep digging, confirm it absolutely, and tell no one except him. From back of the yards, Corbin drove to Lincoln Park, to Monique Falcone's mansion, the 3-story red brick house on Belden Street where he had grown up after his father took him out of the Bridgeport apartment, the house where every brick carried memory, but not one carried warmth. Monique opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been waiting. And maybe she had been waiting, because Monique Falcone always knew more than she said, and arrived earlier than she needed to. She led him into the living room, poured tea without asking whether he wanted any, sat down in the armchair across from him, and looked at him with eyes that age had not dimmed, only sharpened. Corbin did not circle around it. "Do you believe Finch is dead?" Monique set her teacup down slowly, the rosary still wrapped around her left wrist, and she spoke in a voice as flat as a frozen lake. "I doubted it too. From the first night. The sealed coffin, Paxton not letting anyone get close, the explosion too neat for an accident, but I had no evidence, only a mother's instinct." Then she looked straight into Corbin's eyes, and in that gaze was something Corbin did not often see in his mother. Not fear, not anger, but confusion, the kind of confusion belonging to a woman who had lived 63 years in the underworld, and still could not understand her own child. "But if Finch is alive, why hasn't he come home? Why hasn't he come to me, or to you? What is he so afraid of that he had to die to escape it?" Corbin did not answer, because that question drove itself into a place inside him where he did not want to be pierced, into the place where the answer might be him, that Finch was afraid of his own older brother, and Corbin was not ready to look at that possibility. He left his mother's house with more questions than he had arrived with. On the way back, Trent called. Trent's voice was calm but faster than usual, the kind of faster Corbin had learned to read as trouble. Two men came to Gwen Pratt's flower shop this morning, asked about Val, asked whether she was coming to work today, whether she had a new phone number, whether she had mentioned any funeral recently. Mrs. Pratt said she didn't know anything, but they waited outside in a car for almost an hour before leaving. Corbin tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Paxton was looking for Val, and he had started in exactly the place anyone with half a brain would start, where she worked, the person she trusted, the only thread tying her to her old world. He told Trent to have someone watch the flower shop and protect Gwen from a distance, without letting her know. When Corbin returned to the penthouse, Val was sitting on the living room sofa, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around a pillow, eyes turned toward the glass wall but seeing nothing at all. Trent had told her. Corbin could see it on her face. Not fear for herself, but fear for someone else. The kind of fear that ate into the gut more deeply than any direct threat, because it carried guilt with it. The feeling that her existence was putting someone else in danger. Gwen has nothing to do with this, Val said, her voice tight as a string pulled too hard. She's 55 years old, lives alone, and opened the flower shop because she loves flowers, not because it makes money. She was the only person who visited my mother in the hospital besides me. She was the only one. Corbin listened and noted that the word only had been repeated twice, and he understood the weight of that word in the mouth of someone who had no one. He said Gwen would be protected. He did not explain how. Val did not ask more, because she had learned that in this building, Corbin Falcone's assurance did not need explanation. It either happened or it didn't. On the second night in the penthouse, Val could not sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling in the dark, thinking about Gwen, about the flower shop, about the night shift at the bar she had lost, about her $43 life slowly dissolving while she lay on a $2,000 bed that was not hers. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, she got up, walked out to the living room, and saw that the balcony door was open. Corbin stood outside, leaning against the railing, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Chicago spread beneath him like a carpet of light that he partly owned but did not belong to. The wind from Lake Michigan blew cold and carried the smell of water. And Val stepped out onto the balcony not because she wanted to talk to him, but because the penthouse was too still, and that stillness was eating her from the inside. She stood an arm's length away from him, leaning against the railing, looking down at the streets where she used to drive the flower delivery van every day, and she asked without looking at him, "Are you afraid? If your brother is really dead?" Corbin did not answer right away. He took a sip of whiskey, letting the cold of the liquor and the cold of the wind mix together, and when he spoke, his voice was different from every other time Val had heard it. Not the voice of command or the flat voice without emotion, but the voice of someone saying something he had never said to anyone. "I'm afraid of something worse than death. I'm afraid he's alive and chose not to come back to me." Val turned to look at him, and for the first time she did not see the Mafia boss, did not see the man who had broken into her apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning, did not see the man standing on top of a tower looking down at the city, as if he were a god looking down at ants. She saw an older brother who did not know whether his younger brother feared him so much he had to fake his own death to escape, and she understood that pain, understood it down to the bone, because she too had someone who had chosen not to come back. Her father had not died. He had walked out the door of their apartment in Humboldt Park when she was 11 years old, said he would come back, and never came back. He sent no letter, made no call, did not come to her mother's funeral, sent no flowers, sent not a single word. He chose to disappear, and his disappearance was crueler than death, because death at least gave the people left behind the right to mourn, while disappearance only gave them the right to wonder what they had done wrong. "I had someone who chose not to come back too," Val said softly, not looking at him, looking down at the city lights. "My father. He didn't die. He just decided I wasn't worth staying for." Corbin turned to look at her. The wind pushed her hair to one side, and the light from the living room spilled out just enough for him to see her face. No tears, no trembling, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had carried a wound long enough for it to become part of her body. He did not say, "I understand," because he hated when people said those words without understanding. He did not say, "I'm sorry," because apologizing on behalf of her father was something he had no right to do. He only stood there beside her, on the highest balcony, between Chicago and the night sky. And for the first time in a very long while, Corbin Falcone did not feel alone. Not because she belonged to his world, but because she carried the same scar he carried, The kind of scar ordinary people could not see, but people who carried it recognized at once. The kind of scar left by family when they chose to walk away without looking back. They stood still on the balcony, saying nothing more, and the silence between them this time was not the silence of captor and captive, but the silence of two people realizing for the first time that the other was bleeding in the same place. 3 days after the night on the balcony, Trent Braddock knocked on the door of Corbin's study at 6 a.m. with a face that, in 12 years of serving the Falcone family, he had worn exactly 3 times, and all 3 times had been when the world was about to turn upside down. Corbin was sitting behind his desk, his coffee untouched, the family financial files open in front of him, and when he looked up and saw Trent's face, he knew at once that whatever Trent was about to say would split his life into before and after. Trent placed a phone on the desk, its screen already open to 4 photographs taken from a distance with a long lens, and spoke briefly. Finch. Alive. A safe house in rural Wisconsin, about 40 minutes by car from Kenosha. A wooden house in the middle of a field, bought through a shell company I traced back to an account Paxton opened 6 months ago. Corbin looked at the photographs. In the first one, Finch was standing in front of the porch, 32 years old, thinner than the last time Corbin had seen him, unshaven, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, looking like a man who was hiding, not like a man who was dying, and his younger brother's face, in that secretly taken photograph, looked like the face of a stranger, wearing the skin of someone he used to know. In the second photograph, Finch was sitting on the steps, talking on the phone. In the third, he was receiving a bag of supplies from a delivery man. In the fourth, he stood beside a window looking out over the field, and on his face there was not the fear of someone being held captive, but the relief of someone who had finally laid down a burden, and that relief cut into Corbin more deeply than any blade, because it meant Finch hadn't been kidnapped, hadn't been forced, hadn't been imprisoned. Finch was there because Finch wanted to be there, Trent continued, his voice steady, professional, but his eyes never left Corbin's face, because Trent had been in this work long enough to know that the next piece of news would be more dangerous than the first. I traced the account that bought the house. It leads to a series of transfers from the family's money laundering pipeline, $12 million, withdrawn gradually over the past 8 months, split into hundreds of small transactions to avoid raising alarms. The person withdrawing the money was Finch. He managed the financial side. He had access to every account. And the person who approved those transactions, the one who signed off every time the money moved, was Paxton. Corbin didn't move. "There's more," Trent said. And he hesitated for the first time in the conversation. Not out of fear, but because he knew the next part would hurt. "Orla Kinney. I've been watching her since the funeral, like you ordered. She didn't cry when she went home. She didn't call Finch's family. She drove straight to Paxton's apartment in River North, used her own key to get in, and stayed until morning. I checked deeper. She's been going in and out of that apartment at least 3 times a week for the past 4 months. Orla isn't a grieving fiancé. She's Paxton's lover, and her relationship with Finch was a cover, so she could get close to the family's financial information from the inside." Trent stopped and waited. In 12 years, he had seen Corbin Falcone receive news of murder, betrayal, war between families, and every time, the reaction had been different, but it had always had a shape, an order, a nod, a question, something that showed the machine inside him was still operating. This time there was nothing. Corbin sat motionless, both hands resting on the desk, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Finch standing beside the window with that look of relief on his face. And he said nothing, didn't breathe harder, didn't clench his jaw, didn't make a fist. He only sat there, and the stillness coming off him wasn't calm. It was emptiness. The kind of emptiness a bomb leaves after it goes off, when the sound is gone and only thick air remains, waiting to collapse. Then he stood, slowly, walked to the liquor cabinet, poured whiskey into a glass, unhurried, every motion precise as ritual, and returned to the desk, sat down, took a slow sip, his eyes looking straight ahead but seeing nothing at all. His eyes were empty. Not angry, not wounded, not shocked. Empty. The emptiness of a man who had just had everything inside him pulled out all at once. His younger brother had betrayed him. The advisor his father had entrusted to him before he died had betrayed him. The woman he had considered his future sister-in-law had betrayed him, and 3 knives striking at the same time did not create 3 separate wounds, but one single hole large enough for everything he believed in to fall through. Trent stood beside the desk, motionless, and in his mind there was one thought that 12 years of experience had hardened into instinct. Corbin Falcone, shouting was dangerous. Corbin Falcone slamming his hand on the desk was very dangerous. But Corbin Falcone sitting still, drinking whiskey with empty eyes, that was when he was most dangerous. Because that was when he was no longer reacting. He was deciding, and decisions born in Corbin Falcone's silence were decisions people did not come back from. Corbin finished the glass, set it down on the desk, gently, without a sound, and spoke the only 2 sentences he had said in the entire 15 minutes since Trent had entered the room. "No one finds out Finch is alive. Not yet." Trent nodded and stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Corbin alone in the study with 4 photographs of his younger brother on the phone, an empty whiskey glass, and the truth that the man he had trusted most in the world had watched him grieve in front of an empty coffin, without blinking. That afternoon, Orla Kinney rang the penthouse bell without warning. Eyes red, a handkerchief in her hand, her voice choked just enough that Trent had no reason to refuse when she said she wanted to see Corbin and offer her condolences over Finch. Trent said Corbin wasn't home. Orla said she would wait, and before Trent could object, she had already crossed the threshold with the ease of someone who had once come and gone from this place as the fiancé of the homeowner's younger brother. She sat in the living room for less than 5 minutes, her eyes sweeping the room with a habit she hid behind her tears. And then she saw them. A pair of worn, cheap women's flats sitting by the hallway door, leading to the guest bedroom, the kind of lower-class footwear that had absolutely no business being in Corbin Falcone's penthouse. Beside them was a thin, faded fabric coat draped over the back of a chair, clearly not Corbin's, and completely alien to his world. Orla's expression did not change. She cried for a few more minutes, told Trent she would come back when Corbin was home, then stepped into the elevator, and the moment the doors closed, she wiped away her tears in one motion, took out her phone, and called Paxton Greer. "There's a woman in the penthouse. Cheap shoes, cheap coat. Not anyone from our world. You said the flower delivery girl disappeared, but I don't think she's disappeared at all." 2 hours later, Corbin left the penthouse to meet Wes and collect the final DNA confirmation, and Trent went with him. Before leaving, Corbin told Val to stay in her room, lock the door, not go outside, and that he would be back in a few hours. He left 2 guards posted downstairs in the lobby, and only a single guard stationed outside the penthouse doors, because Trent was the only man he trusted completely with her safety. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was not knowing that Paxton Greer had bribed a maintenance worker in the building before Finch died, and that man had a key card to the technical floor connected to the penthouse's side hallway. 2 men stepped out of the service door at 9 o'clock at night, quick and silent, the kind of silent belonging to men paid not to make a sound. The first was tall, hair cropped close, a folding knife in his jacket pocket. The second was shorter, broad-shouldered, hands covered in black gloves. They moved down the side hallway toward the penthouse living room door, and Val heard them. Not their footsteps, but something else. The faint, almost invisible sound of a hand turning a doorknob. And Val heard it because she had grown up in Pilsen, in an apartment with walls thin as paper and neighbors fighting at 2 o'clock in the morning, where she had learned to sleep with one ear always open and to tell the difference between a rat running and a person walking, because in Pilsen, that difference could be the difference between living and not living until morning. She rolled off the bed without making a sound, bare feet on cold stone, her heart pounding in her ears. But her hands did not shake because fear and survival instinct were 2 different things, and Val had lived long enough by the second one to know how to shut off the first. She heard a heavy sound in the hallway, flesh hitting the wall, a muffled growl, and she knew the guard had been taken down. She had no weapon. She had no phone because it was charging in the living room. She had 3 seconds before the bedroom door opened. She ran into the bathroom, closed the door, and looked around for anything. The mirror above the sink, thin metal frame, mounted with 4 screws, and Val ripped it off the wall with a pull she did not know she was strong enough to make until it was in her hands. Then she smashed it against the edge of the stone sink. The mirror broke into 3 large pieces, and she chose the longest shard, wrapped a towel around one end to make a handle, and stood behind the bathroom door with the piece of mirror in her hand like a handmade knife she had never imagined she would need. The bedroom door was kicked open. Footsteps crossed the floor, fast, purposeful. Then the bathroom door was kicked in, and the tall man stepped inside, his folding knife already open, and he did not have time to be surprised that the bathroom was dark, because Val had turned off the light. Darkness was the only thing she had, and she used it. She slashed the mirror shard from behind the door, cutting across his face from temple to chin, and he screamed, his hand flying to his face, blood pouring through his fingers, but he still swung back, the folding knife slicing into Val's left arm, deep enough for her to feel the skin open, and warm blood run down to her elbow, but not deep enough to make her drop the weapon. She kicked him in the knee. He lost his balance on the wet floor, and Val slipped through the bathroom door and ran into the bedroom just as the second man blocked her at the doorway. And at that exact moment, the elevator opened. Corbin Falcone stepped into the penthouse, Trent behind him, and what happened next took less than 10 seconds. But every second held enough violence for Val to remember for the rest of her life. Corbin did not shout. He did not draw a gun. He moved toward the second man, blocking Val at the bedroom door, and ended him in 3 motions. A punch to the throat that made him choke, a hand dragging his head down just as Corbin's knee drove upward, and when the man's body folded, one twist of the neck put him on the floor, motionless. Trent handled the first man in the bathroom, the one clutching his blood-covered face from Val's cut, and the sounds from inside were short and final. It was all over before Val could draw 3 breaths. Corbin looked down at the man on the bedroom floor, then looked at Val, saw the blood on her arm, saw the mirror shard wrapped in a towel in her hand, saw her eyes wide but not crying, and then he looked toward the first man in the bathroom, with the long slash across his face, and he understood that she had fought for herself before he arrived, that she had waited for no one to save her, that she had taken a mirror, wrapped a towel around it, turned off the light, and cut her attacker with the instinct of someone who had lived her whole life in a world where no one came to rescue her. He turned to the surviving man on the bathroom floor, crouched down, and asked in a voice Trent had heard many times but had never grown used to, a voice utterly flat, without a trace of feeling, like the surface of a frozen lake hiding black water underneath. "Who sent you?" The man looked at Corbin through blood and fear, and Corbin looked back, and both of them knew the answer before it was spoken. Later, after Trent had dragged the 2 attackers out of the penthouse and the hallway had been cleaned, Corbin sat on the bathroom floor beside Val, with the first aid kit open in front of him. He held her left arm gently, turning it to see the cut under the light, and began wiping away the blood with alcohol-soaked gauze. His hands, the same hands that had broken a man's neck less than 10 minutes earlier, now moved over her skin with a care Val had never received from anyone. Slow, precise, each layer of gauze wrapping around her arm as if he were handling something more precious than anything in this penthouse. Val trembled, not because of the pain. The cut stung, but it did not hurt as much as things she had already endured, but because of those hands, because of a gentleness that had no reason to exist in the hands of a man like him. Because for the first time in a very long time, longer than she wanted to admit, someone was sitting beside her after something terrible had happened, and did not leave. "I'm sorry," Corbin said, his eyes still on the wound, his hands still winding the gauze. "I shouldn't have left you alone." Val looked at the top of his head, bowed over her arm, and she said something she had not meant to say, but it slipped out before she could hold it back. Her voice small, tired, true. "I shouldn't have walked through the wrong door that night." Corbin's hands paused for one breath, then kept wrapping the gauze, and he did not look up when he spoke, softly, almost more to himself than to her. Maybe it was the right door. The morning after the attack, Corbin drove to Lincoln Park alone. He didn't bring Trent, didn't bring anyone, because the conversation he was about to have was not meant for outside ears, no matter how loyal those ears might be. He parked in front of the red brick house on Belden Street, sat in the car looking at the oak door he had walked through thousands of times since he was 15 years old, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to step into his mother's house. He went in. Monique was sitting at the kitchen table, the rosary still around her wrist, a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, and she watched him enter with the eyes of someone who had been waiting for this moment since the night of the funeral, knowing it would come, only not knowing when. Corbin didn't sit down. He stood across from her, the kitchen table between them like a boundary, and placed his phone on the table, opened the photograph of Finch standing in front of the wooden house in Wisconsin, and pushed it toward his mother. Monique looked at the photograph. She didn't draw in a sharp breath, didn't lift her hand to her mouth, didn't show any reaction of a person seeing her son rise from the dead. She only looked, for a long while, then closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, Corbin already knew. "You knew?" he said, not as a question, and his voice wasn't angry, not yet able to be angry, because this sat in a place deeper than anger, in a place language hadn't named. Monique nodded, once, slowly, as if that single nod weighed as much as everything she had kept inside all these weeks. "From the beginning?" he asked. "From before the explosion happened," she said, her voice flat. But her hand was squeezing the rosary so tightly that her knuckles were even whiter than they had been on the night of the funeral. "Finch came to see me 3 days before he died. He said he had to go. He said he had taken the money. He said if he didn't disappear, then when you found out, you would have to handle him according to the law, and he was right." Corbin felt the floor beneath his feet tilt, not because of the truth about Finch, but because of the truth about his mother, that she had known, that she had stood beside him at the funeral, sat in the front row, squeezing her rosary, watching him place his hand on the coffin lid and demand to see his brother one last time, and she had sat there knowing there was nothing inside, and hadn't said a word. "You stood there and watched me in front of an empty coffin," he said, and for the first time, something broke at the edge of his voice. Small, like a crack in bulletproof glass, not enough to destroy it, but enough to know the blow had landed. "You watched me hurt. You knew everything, and you chose him." Monique rose from her chair, slowly, 63 years old, but her back still straight as iron, and she looked at her son with eyes where tears did not spill outward but were rising within, the kind of tears belonging to a woman who had spent her whole life in a world where crying was a privilege she wasn't allowed to have. "I didn't choose him. I chose both of my sons alive. Do you understand? If Finch had stayed, you would have discovered the missing money. The family law, the law your father left behind, the law you swore to uphold. What does it say? Blood betrayal must be paid for in blood. You would have had to kill your brother. Or you would spare him and lose power, lose everyone's trust, lose everything your father built. I had no choice that didn't cost me a son. So I chose the one choice where both of you were still breathing. I chose to let Finch die on paper so he could live in the world. I chose to let you hurt in front of an empty coffin, because that pain I could bear. Watching you kill your own brother, I couldn't bear." Corbin stood motionless. He looked at his mother, looked at the rosary around her wrist, looked at the cold tea on the table, looked at the family photograph hanging on the kitchen wall, taken when he was 18 and Finch was 13, the two brothers standing side by side, Finch smiling, Corbin not, and he tried to find the anger inside himself, the anger he knew he should have, but what he found wasn't anger. It was something worse than anger. It was understanding. He understood why his mother had done it. He understood the brutal logic behind every decision. And that understanding didn't lessen the pain. It made it hurt more, because it meant his mother was right, that he had become the kind of man his younger brother had to fake his own death to escape, and his mother had to lie to protect him from, that he was the greatest danger to his own family. He said nothing more. He turned around, walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway, through the oak door, down the steps, and he heard Monique behind him, not calling his name, only saying one sentence, softly, her voice breaking for the first time. "It was the only thing I could do." Corbin didn't turn back. He went out to the car, sat behind the wheel, closed the door, and didn't start the engine. He sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, eyes staring straight through the windshield at the quiet Belden Street, with its maple trees turning color, and he folded in on himself. He didn't cry, didn't punch the steering wheel, didn't scream, only collapsed inward, his forehead resting on his hands, his back bent, as if the spine that had carried too much for too many years had finally refused to carry any more. And he stayed there, folded over the wheel, on Belden Street, alone, longer than he wanted to admit. By the time he returned to the penthouse, the sky had gone dark. Val was sitting at the kitchen table, her left arm still wrapped in gauze from the night before, and when she saw him step out of the elevator, she knew at once that something had happened, not because his face was different. His face was still his face, controlled, flat, letting nothing through, but because his eyes were different. His eyes were no longer cold, they were empty, the kind of empty Val had seen in the bathroom mirror at Cook County Hospital the night her mother died, the kind of empty belonging to someone who had just lost something no word could name, not a person, but faith, foundation, the thing you thought was real only to learn it had never been real at all. She didn't ask. She didn't say, "Are you okay?" because she hated that question, had hated it since every person who came to her mother's funeral asked her that, and not one of them truly wanted to hear the answer. She stood up, went into the kitchen, made coffee with the expensive machine it had taken her 2 days to figure out how to use, poured it into a cup, carried it over and set it in front of him on the table, then sat down in the chair across from him. She said nothing. She only sat there. Corbin looked at the cup of coffee, looked at her hand resting on the table, the hand marked with rose thorn scars and white gauze wrapped around her forearm, and he realized she was doing something no one in his world knew how to do. She was simply here without demanding anything, without asking anything, without wanting anything, only here, and that presence, simple and unconditional, cut through every layer of armor he wore more easily than any blade. "I know what it feels like to be betrayed by family," Val said softly, not looking at him but looking at the cup of coffee, as if she were speaking to both of them, to him and to herself. "My father didn't die. He chose to disappear. And sometimes that hurts more than death, because death at least is final. Disappearing leaves the door half open, and a person keeps standing in front of that door waiting, year after year, until they realize they're no longer waiting for someone to come back. They're waiting for themselves to become strong enough to close it." Corbin looked at her, and this time he truly looked, not to judge, not to calculate, not at a witness or a burden, or the flower delivery girl with $43 in her wallet. He looked at a human being carrying a wound like his, not the same shape but the same depth, the kind of wound made by the people who were supposed to stay when they chose to walk away, and he realized that in the cold penthouse above the city, amid the empire his mother had lied to preserve and his brother had faked his death to escape, the flower delivery girl sitting across from him with a cup of coffee and a bandaged arm was the realest person he had ever met. 2 days after the night Corbin collapsed over the steering wheel on Belden Street. He called Trent into the study and closed the door. Val sat in the living room, hearing the low voices of the two men carry through the wall without making out a single word. And she knew that whatever was being discussed behind that door involved her, because everything in this building had involved her since the night she walked into Monarch Memorial Chapel. When the door opened, Corbin came to her, sat in the chair across from her, and spoke in a voice she had begun to recognize. Not his commanding voice, not his flat and cold voice, but the voice he used when he was telling the truth and knew that truth would hurt. "I have a plan to end this, but you need to know before you agree, because it involves you directly." Val looked at him and waited. Corbin explained briefly, without circling around it, without softening it. He would leak false information that Val was at an old warehouse on the south side, through a channel he knew Paxton was still monitoring. Paxton would send people to deal with her, just as he had sent 2 killers to the penthouse. But this time, Paxton would have to come closer because he couldn't tolerate another failure. When Paxton made his move, Corbin's people would already be waiting in ambush, catch him in the act, and end it. Val was the bait. "The plan is dangerous," Corbin said, and he looked straight into her eyes as he said it, not looking away, not hiding behind indirect language, because he owed her at least that much honesty. "But if we don't do this, Paxton will never stop hunting you. He'll find you anywhere I hide you. He won't stop because he can't stop. You know too much, and people who know too much in this world have only 2 choices: stay silent forever, or turn the person who wants them silent into someone who can no longer give orders." Val looked down at her hands in her lap, at the gauze wrapped around her left arm, at the rose, thorn scars on her fingers, and she thought not about the danger, but about the exhaustion. She was tired in a way no sleep could cure, the kind of tired that had been building for 16 years since her father left, from 5 years of counting money to pay debts, from every night serving drinks at a bar and smiling at strangers while she felt hollow inside, from every Monday morning hearing the debt collector's call and wondering when life would finally stop chasing her. She had been running her whole life, running from bills, running from loneliness, running from the memory of her mother on a hospital bed, running from the ghost of the father who disappeared. And now she was running from the hired killers of a Mafia boss who was 52 years old and wanted her dead because she had overheard the wrong 7 words. "Fine," she said. And her voice did not shake, did not sound heroic, only flat with the acceptance of someone who had run out of places to run. "I agree. Not because I'm brave, because I'm tired. I'm tired of running. This time I want to stand still, even if standing still might mean falling." Corbin looked at her for 3 more seconds, and in his eyes there was something Trent, standing behind him, recognized but had never seen in his boss before. Not respect, because Corbin respected many people, but something closer, more dangerous, the kind of thing a man like Corbin Falcone wasn't allowed to have because it made him weak in the place where he needed to be strongest. The night before the plan was carried out, Val couldn't sleep. She got up near midnight, walked into the living room, and stopped. On the table beside the window, where before there had only been bare glass looking out over Chicago, there was a vase of flowers, white roses, pale pink peonies, a few sprigs of lavender, arranged not in the style of a shop display, but in the style of someone who had told the florist exactly which flowers, which colors, and in what way. Val stood before the vase, and she knew with certainty, without needing to ask, that Corbin had had the flowers brought because he knew she wouldn't be able to sleep tonight, and flowers were the only thing that calmed her. Not because he had guessed, because he had watched her over the past few days, had seen her touch the petals on the kitchen table whenever she was anxious, had seen her smell lavender before sleeping, had seen the small things no one else bothered to notice, because no one else had looked at her long enough to see. Corbin stepped out from the hallway behind her, quiet, but she knew he was there because she had begun to recognize his presence by something other than hearing. "You know I like flowers," she said, her hand touching a peony petal, without turning around. "I know you need flowers," he said. "There's a difference." Val turned to look at him. He stood 3 steps away from her, the night light of Chicago spilling through the glass wall onto one side of his face, half bright, half dark. And she thought that was the truest image of who he was, always in between, always half one thing and half another, and she was standing on that line without knowing which side she would fall toward. "If something happens to me tomorrow," she said, and her voice was smaller than she wanted, but truer than she had meant it to be. "Don't take revenge for me. I don't want any more blood spilled in my name. I'm just the flower delivery girl, Corbin. Don't turn me into a reason for more people to die." Corbin stepped closer to her. 2 steps. 1 step. The distance disappeared between them like something they had both held on to for too long, finally letting go. And he lifted his hand, touched her face, his palm resting against her cheek, and Val felt that hand on her skin. Warm, dry, calloused at the knuckles. The hand that had pulled triggers, had broken a man's neck, had signed orders she did not want to know about, and that hand now rested on her cheek with a care she had never received from any hand before, as if she were the most fragile thing he had ever touched, and he knew that his own hand was the most dangerous thing to anything fragile. "I can't promise you that," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on hers, and Val saw in them something she had never imagined she would see at the bottom of the Chicago Mafia boss's eyes. Not desire, though that was there too, but fear of losing her. Fear in the way only someone who had already lost too much knew how to fear. "Because if anyone touches you, I'll burn this whole city down." Val did not step back. She shouldn't be here, shouldn't be standing this close to him, shouldn't be letting that hand rest on her face, shouldn't be feeling what she was feeling, because every piece of reason, every lesson, every warning her mother had ever given her, said this was the edge of a cliff. But Val had been standing on the edge of a cliff her whole life, and no one had ever stood there beside her. And tonight, on the night before the day she might die, she did not want to stand on that edge alone anymore. She kissed him, or he kissed her, or both of them fell into each other in the same instant, with no one yielding first. The first kiss, not gentle, not romantic, full of desperation and pain and longing, the kind of kiss shared by 2 people about to walk into a storm without knowing whether they would make it out, the kind of kiss that did not promise a future, but held on to the present moment with everything they had, and she tasted whiskey on his lips, and he caught the scent of lavender in her hair, and Chicago burned bright beyond the glass wall, but both of them closed their eyes because in that moment, the outside world did not exist. Only 2 scarred people finding each other in the darkness and choosing not to let go, even if only for tonight. The warehouse sat on the south side, on an industrial street, 3 blocks from the harbor, where at night there was nothing but murky yellow sodium light spilling across peeling brick walls and the sound of freight trains making the ground tremble every 40 minutes. Corbin chose this place because it was far enough away for Paxton to believe it was a hiding place, enclosed enough for the trap to work, and familiar enough to his men that every dark corner had eyes on it before anyone could step inside. Trent had positioned 7 men inside the warehouse since the afternoon, hidden behind empty containers, on the loft, in the old control room at the back, each man knowing the exact location of the others, and no one was allowed to fire before Corbin gave the order. Val sat in the van parked 2 blocks from the warehouse, beside Trent, wearing a dark coat, her hair hidden under a cap, and she wasn't trembling even though she thought she should have been, because fear had passed through her so many times over the past week that it had become something almost like background music, always there, but no longer strong enough to make her pay attention. Corbin stood inside the warehouse, alone in the open center beneath the only industrial lamp left on, and he waited. The false information had been leaked that morning through a communication channel. Corbin knew Paxton was still monitoring, and the message was simple. The flower delivery girl was at a Southside warehouse, only one guard with her. Corbin wouldn't be there until late. Tempting enough for Paxton to believe. Loose enough for Paxton to think this was his last chance before Corbin moved Val somewhere else, and Paxton believed it. At 10:17, the rear door of the warehouse opened, not forced, but with a key, and Corbin noted that because it meant Paxton had keys to every property belonging to the Falcone family, a privilege Corbin's father had given him, and Corbin had never taken back because he had never thought he needed to. 3 men entered first, guns already drawn. Moving in a formation Corbin recognized at once as professional, not hastily hired lackeys like the 2 men at the penthouse, but men who had been trained and paid enough to do the job properly. Then Paxton Greer crossed the threshold, 52 years old, black wool coat, silver hair neat beneath the sodium light, and he walked into the warehouse with the steps of a man who believed he was coming to solve the final problem, remove the final piece before $12 million, and a new life became a perfect reality. He didn't have time to say a word. The warehouse lights came on all at once, every one of them, blinding white, and Corbin's 7 men stepped out from every direction, guns raised, their formation sealing every exit. Paxton's 3 men dropped their guns in less than 4 seconds because they were paid to kill, not paid to die, and that difference showed itself the instant the odds turned against them. Paxton stood in the middle of the warehouse, the white light pouring down on him like a stage light, and he watched Corbin step out of the darkness behind the container on the right, slow, calm, no weapon in his hand, and on Corbin's face was something Paxton recognized immediately, because Paxton had taught him that expression. It was the face of a man who had already made his decision and was now carrying it out. "Corbin," Paxton said, and his voice was still smooth, still measured, still holding the shell of composure shaped by 52 years. But his eyes had changed, the eyes of an animal realizing the trap had closed. "Let me explain." "I don't need you to explain," Corbin said, stopping 4 steps from Paxton, close enough to look into his eyes, far enough not to touch him, because he knew that if he touched Paxton now, he wouldn't stop. "I know Finch is alive. I know about the 12 million. I know about Orla. I know everything. What I don't know is why. Why you, the man my father called a brother, stood beside an empty coffin and watched me hurt without blinking." Paxton was silent for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, something changed on his face. The smoothness fell away. The calm cracked. And beneath it was his real face, not the face of a remorseful traitor, but the face of a man who had carried a secret for too long and now found that secret too heavy to carry any longer. Then he laughed, softly, tiredly, the laugh of a man who knew he had lost but still had 1 card left. "You think Finch stole?" Paxton said, and his voice changed, no longer smooth, but sharp as a blade turning over. "You think he woke up one fine day and decided to take 12 million from his own family? He took that money because your father owed it. Your father, Angelo Falcone, that saint in your head, left behind a blood debt to Beau Whitmore, 15 million. From a deal that collapsed 20 years ago, a deal he buried completely. Beau kept quiet all those years because your old man was alive and Beau was afraid. But when he died, Beau came to collect. Finch knew because Finch handled the finances. I knew because I was the only one Angelo told before he died. Your mother knew because she always knows everything. Only you, Corbin, the protected favorite son kept away from every ugly truth, didn't know." Corbin stood motionless. Each of Paxton's words fell into him like drops of acid, not burning at once, but eating slowly through him, and he felt everything he had built, everything he had believed, everything he had killed to preserve, shifting on a foundation that had never truly been solid. His father wasn't a man who built an empire on honor. His father was a man who built an empire on lies and left the debt for his son to carry without saying a word. He wasn't the heir to a dynasty. He was the heir to a lie. Paxton looked at him, and in his eyes there was something almost like pity, but not quite pity, closer to the exhaustion of a man who had held the truth too long for someone who had never wanted to hear it. I didn't help Finch because I wanted the money. 40% was just the price for my silence. I helped him because if Beau Whitmore didn't get paid, he wouldn't come with lawyers. He would come with bullets. And the first person to die wouldn't be you. It would be your mother. Corbin said nothing. He stood in the middle of the South Side warehouse, beneath the blinding white lights, surrounded by 7 loyal men holding guns aimed at the man he had once called uncle, and he realized that of everyone who had betrayed him, his brother, his mother, his advisor, each of them had a reason, and every reason led back to the same source. His father, the man who had died in a sickbed 6 years ago, with a secret on his lips and one final lie, that this empire was clean and sun. You must preserve it. Corbin turned and walked out of the warehouse, saying only 2 words to Trent over the phone. Hold him. And he drove into the Chicago night, alone, with the truth that his father was not the king he had imagined, but the best liar in a family made entirely of liars. Corbin drove for 4 hours through the night, from the south side of Chicago, along Interstate 94 heading north, past Kenosha, then turned onto the rural Wisconsin roads where the signs grew farther apart and the darkness thickened between silent cornfields. He didn't turn on music, didn't call anyone, didn't think about anything except the road ahead and his younger brother's face in the secret photograph Trent had given him a few days earlier, the relieved face of someone who had finally set down a burden, and that burden was him. The wooden house sat at the end of a dirt road. No neighbors, no streetlights, only a weak yellow glow spilling from the kitchen window like a candle in the wilderness. And when Corbin shut off the engine and sat in the dark looking at the house, he saw a shadow moving inside, slowly, alone. The shadow of his brother, the man he had wept for in front of an empty coffin, the man his mother had lied to protect, the man the whole family had conspired to fake as dead in order to hide him from Corbin. And he sat there for another 5 minutes before opening the car door, because he needed those 5 minutes to decide who he would be when he walked through that door, the brother or the boss, because he couldn't be both at the same time. He knocked. He didn't break the lock, didn't kick the door, didn't walk in like the owner. He knocked 3 times and waited. Inside, there was silence for 10 seconds, the kind of silence belonging to someone deciding whether to run or face what had come for him. Then the door opened, and Finch Falcone stood before his older brother for the first time since he had died. 32 years old, but looking older than the last time Corbin had seen him. Thin, his jawbones sharper, dark circles beneath his eyes, several days of beard on his face, wearing an old flannel shirt and jeans faded at the knees. And he looked at Corbin with eyes Corbin recognized from the time they were both boys. The eyes Finch had always had when facing his older brother, half admiration and half fear. Except now, the admiration was gone, and only the fear remained, bare, undisguised, the fear of a small animal when the larger animal had found its den. "Are you going to kill me?" Finch said, and his voice didn't shake because he had asked himself that question hundreds of times during the weeks he had been hiding in this wooden house, asked it so many times that it had lost its weight and become something almost like a question about the weather, flat, accepting, as if the answer, whatever it was, couldn't be worse than living while waiting for it. Corbin looked at his brother. He looked closely, searching that face for the 13-year-old boy in the photograph on their mother's kitchen wall, the boy who smiled while Corbin didn't, the boy who used to chase him around the backyard of the Lincoln Park house, begging to be allowed to play too, reminding Corbin of that innocent child, a stark contrast to the broken brother he had sworn to protect the night their father died 6 years ago, when he held Finch's hand outside the hospital room and said, "I can handle it. You don't have to be afraid of anything." "What do you think I came here to do?" Corbin asked back, and he meant the question, not as a threat, because he wanted to know what Finch saw when he looked at him, the boss or the brother, and the answer would tell him when he had lost his younger brother. Finch stepped back, leaving the door open, turned inside, and Corbin followed. The house was small, simple, an open kitchen connected to the living room, a wooden table marked by water rings, a window looking out over the black field, and on the table were an open laptop, a half-empty glass of water, and a backpack already packed, as if Finch were always ready to run again at any moment. Finch stood beside the table, his hands gripping the edge as if he were holding onto a life raft, and he spoke without looking at Corbin, his eyes fixed on the dark field outside the window. I don't know. I don't know what you came here to do. I only know I couldn't live one more day in your shadow. Corbin said nothing. He stood in the small living room, 4 steps from his brother, and listened. Do you know when I started being afraid of you? Finch said, his voice growing smaller, but each word clear, like a man who had rehearsed this speech in his head through hundreds of nights. It wasn't the first time you killed someone. I'd known what this world was since I was 16. I became afraid of you the day I realized you didn't hate it. You didn't like it, but you didn't hate it either. You just did it, like breathing, like driving, and I watched you lose another piece of yourself every year. The piece that knew how to laugh, the piece that knew how to sit still without calculating, the piece that knew how to look at me without judging whether I was strong enough to be worthy. I didn't take the money because I was greedy. I took it because it was the only way out. Father left the debt behind, yes, and I used part of the money to pay Beau Whitmore so he wouldn't come knocking at Mother's door. But the rest, I used to die, because no one leaves the Falcone family alive. You know that law. You live by that law. And I didn't want to really die, so I died on paper. Corbin stood there listening to every word, and every word was a door opening into a room he had locked inside himself long ago, the room that held the truth that he had not only lost his brother, he was the reason his brother had to erase himself from the earth. He had become something his own blood had to flee. He had become the man his younger brother looked at and no longer saw a brother, only a sentence. He had become the very thing he had sworn to protect Finch from on the night their father died, and that irony did not cut him. It crushed him, slowly, heavily, like a millstone. I'm sorry, Corbin said, and those 2 words left his mouth before he could control them, before the boss inside him could stop them, because it wasn't the boss speaking. It was the 15-year-old older brother who had held his little brother's hand outside a hospital room and promised he would handle everything, and he had not handled it. He had become the thing that needed to be handled. Finch turned back to look at him, and something broke open on his face. Not fear anymore, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had carried too heavy a secret for too long, and now that the secret was out, he no longer knew what would hold him upright. Corbin looked at the backpack on the table, looked at the laptop, looked at the little house in the middle of the field, and he made a decision not from logic or family law, but from something deeper, something Val had awakened in him when she sat across from him and made coffee without asking anything, something he had thought was dead but had only been sleeping. You're dead, Corbin said, his voice low, each word heavy as soil being shoveled down. To me, to the family, to everyone. I'll have someone make you a new identity, clean papers, enough money to start over. But you leave Chicago, leave Illinois, leave everything with the Falcone name on it, and you never come back. Finch looked at him, and there was water in his eyes for the first time in their conversation. Not much, only enough for the yellow kitchen light to catch it. And he nodded once, slowly, the kind of nod that was not agreement, but goodbye. Are you going to be okay? Finch asked, and that question, simple, real, wounded, was the thing that finally broke Corbin, because it meant that after everything, after running and faking his death and betrayal, Finch was still asking whether his brother would be all right, still worrying about the person he feared most in the world, and that was both beautiful and cruel, in the way only love between brothers could be. Go, Corbin said, and his voice did not break, but it came close enough that Finch heard it, and Finch picked up the backpack, walked past his older brother, stopped at the door for 1 second, did not look back, then stepped outside, into the dark, into the field, into the new life where he would carry nothing from the old one, except the memory of the brother who had let him go when he could have kept him forever. Corbin stood alone in the wooden house in rural Wisconsin. The half-empty glass of water sat on the table. The laptop was shut. The chair was still warm from where Finch had been sitting, and the silence was not the silence of the penthouse, or the silence of the warehouse, or the silence of a car, but the silence of a room where the last person had just left and would not return. He sat down in the chair his brother had just left, placed his hand on the table, and cried. He didn't scream, didn't collapse, didn't fold in on himself, only cried, tears running down his face in silence like rain sliding over glass, And he didn't wipe them away because there was no one there to preserve dignity for. For the first time in 15 years, there was no one there to preserve dignity for. And he sat there crying in the wooden house in the middle of a Wisconsin field for the younger brother he had just lost for the second time, this time forever. This time because he had chosen to let him go. And the pain of letting go was not lighter than the pain of losing. It was only different. Different because it came with the knowledge that he was doing the right thing, and the right thing hurt more than any wrong thing he had ever done in his life. Corbin drove back from Wisconsin just as dawn was breaking, his eyes dry but red, and he did not return to the penthouse. Instead, he drove straight to Rossetti's restaurant in River North, where Beau Whitmore had eaten breakfast every Tuesday for the past 20 years, because men who had held power for a long time always had habits, and habits were what made them easy to find when someone needed to find them. Beau Whitmore sat at the corner table in the back, 58 years old, salt and pepper hair, a broad face, a thick neck, gold rings on 3 fingers, and he watched Corbin walk into the restaurant alone, without guards, with eyes in which surprise lasted only half a second before calculation replaced it. Corbin sat down across from him without being invited, and he spoke directly because he had run out of patience for circling around things since the night he sat crying in the wooden house in the middle of the field. I know about the original $15 million debt my father owed you from 20 years ago, and I know what my brother already transferred to you. I didn't come to argue over pennies or numbers. I came to wipe the slate completely clean, with an offer you can't refuse, ensuring our families are square forever. Beau set down his fork, slowly, and looked at Corbin with an expression Corbin read at once, the look of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time, and had not expected it to arrive as a conversation instead of a war. Pay with what? Beau asked. With Falcone West, Corbin said, and he heard himself say the name of the restaurant and hotel chain his father had built over 15 years, the family's largest legitimate business arm, 6 properties, 3 restaurants, 2 boutique hotels, a total market value higher than the debt. And he said that name in a flat voice. But inside he felt every brick his father had built slipping out of his hands. The old Corbin, the Corbin of 1 week ago, would never have accepted this. Concession was weakness. Surrendering territory was humiliation. Humiliation was loss of power. And loss of power in this world was death. But Corbin had sat on a balcony with the flower delivery girl and listened to her talk about her father disappearing, had stood before his mother and heard her confess that she had chosen lies to keep both of her sons alive, had watched his younger brother step into the darkness with a backpack and the question, "Are you going to be okay?" And he understood now, understood in his bones and not just in his head, that holding on to everything did not mean strength, that an empire built on lies was not worth preserving with more lies, and that sometimes the greatest strength lay in knowing what should be let go. Beau looked at him for 10 more seconds, then nodded once, and the 2 men shook hands over a breakfast table in River North, ending a debt of 20 years with the handshake. Corbin's father should have made himself while he was still alive, but had chosen to hide instead, leaving his son to carry it. When Corbin returned to the penthouse, Val was standing in the living room, the old backpack she had brought from her Pilsen studio sitting on the floor beside her feet, and she had changed back into the clothes she had worn the first night she came here. Not the new clothes in the closet, but her own clothes, faded and thin, and completely hers. Corbin looked at the backpack and understood immediately. "I have to go," Val said, and her voice did not shake, did not sound sad, only still, the kind of stillness she had practiced her whole life, because life had never given her enough time to grieve before demanding that she stand up and keep going. "Paxton has been taken. Finch is gone. You said the danger is over, and I believe you, so I have to go." "Stay," Corbin said, and the word left him faster than he wanted. Not an order, not an offer, closer to a plea, and Corbin Falcone never pleaded with anyone for anything. But he was pleading with her, and that change frightened him more than any family war. Val looked at him, and in her eyes there was something Corbin recognized as pain. Not pain from fear or hatred, but pain from wanting to stay, and knowing she shouldn't, the kind of pain only people who had lost enough understood, because sometimes leaving was the only way to keep what you had from being destroyed. "Stay for what, Corbin?" she said softly, her eyes meeting his without looking away. "To be the Mafia boss's woman? To sit in the penthouse every night waiting for you to come home without knowing what your hands just did? To live in a world where people send killers at 2 o'clock in the morning and call it normal? I'm the flower delivery girl, Corbin. I strip thorns from roses and deliver flowers for weddings and funerals. I don't belong here, and you know that." Corbin did not answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because she was right. Completely right. Right in a way he could not bend with logic or power, and he had spent his life bending everything, but he could not bend the truth from the mouth of the only person he did not want to lie to. She was right that his world was not meant for her. She was right that his hands would never be clean. She was right that staying would turn her into something she was not, and he did not want her to become that. Val bent down, picked up her backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and walked past him, close enough for him to smell the lavender in her hair one last time, and she stopped at the elevator door, did not turn back, and said softly, for both of them to hear, "Thank you, for keeping me alive, and for the flowers." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed, and Corbin stood in the penthouse looking at the steel elevator doors closing in front of him the same way he had stood watching Finch walk into the darkness in Wisconsin. And he realized that within 48 hours, he had let 2 people walk out of his life without holding them back. And each time, letting go did not become easier than the time before. It was only different. And this time it hurt, in a place he had not known he could still feel, until she walked into his flower shop, carrying $300 worth of white lilies, and went through the wrong door. He turned away, walked to the window, looked out over Chicago, and the city beneath his feet looked exactly the same as it had on the day he moved into this penthouse. But everything was different because he was different, and he did not know whether different meant better or only emptier. But before Val stepped into the elevator, before she slung the old backpack over her shoulder, Corbin had already set a silent plan in motion, something she knew nothing about. He did not do it to make her come back, nor did he expect any gratitude. As he stood by the window, he simply remembered the image of her counting those $43 on his expensive bed, a ghost of his own past in Bridgeport. He realized that an empire built on power was meaningless unless it could shield something fragile from the world's cruelty. For Corbin, letting go wasn't just an act of surrender. It was the first time he used his power to truly protect someone, leaving a silent legacy in her life that would only reveal itself when the time was right. 3 months after the elevator doors closed inside the Falcone Tower penthouse, Valerie Ashford stood in the middle of the flower shop on the familiar street, in a Chicago suburb, pruning shears in her hand, her fingers still covered in old and new rose thorn scars. But something had changed. The flower shop still sat between the laundromat and the little cafe, still had the glass door with the bell that rang whenever someone stepped inside, still carried the scent of roses and lavender mingled in the air, but on paper, the shop no longer belonged to Gwen Pratt. Gwen told her one Monday morning, over a cup of tea, her voice gentle but her eyes wet, that an investor had bought the shop when Gwen was about to have to close because the rent had risen beyond what she could bear, and that investor had made only one request, that ownership be transferred into Valerie Ashford's name, with no explanation, no conditions, no name. Val stood there listening to Gwen, and she didn't ask who the investor was because she knew with something deeper than logic, knew the way she knew the scent of lavender before she saw it, knew the way she knew the sound of the shop bell from any other bell, that there was only one person in the world who would do that without leaving a name, because that person had learned from her that real help came without needing anyone to know where it came from. That week, she received a letter from Cook County Hospital. Not a collection letter. For the first time in 2 years, an envelope from the hospital wasn't a collection letter, but a notice that her hospital debt, $47,000, had been paid in full by an anonymous transfer, with no sender's name, no note, only a payment that wiped clean the long-standing debt that had heavily burdened her life through her mother's illness and passing. Val stood in the middle of the flower shop, holding the notice, staring at the 0 on the balance line, and she cried, not from sadness, not from fear, but because she felt light. Light in a way she had forgotten existed. Light because for the first time since her mother lay down, and her father disappeared, and her life became a chain of counting money and running from bills, she owed nothing to anyone. There was no Monday collection call waiting for her, no envelope on the kitchen table threatening her, and she stood among roses and lilies, beneath afternoon sunlight filtering through the glass door, and she smiled, truly smiled. Not the polite smile she wore at the bar or the strained smile she gave customers, but the smile of someone who had just set down a weight she had carried on her back for 2 years and discovered she still knew how to stand straight without it. But she missed him. Every day. She remembered him when she cut white roses. And she remembered the $300 worth of lilies she had carried into Monarch Memorial Chapel that night. She remembered standing on the balcony of her newly rented little apartment and looking out at Chicago at night. Remembered the penthouse balcony. Remembered the whiskey in his hand. Remembered his voice saying, "I'm afraid of something worse than death." She remembered the taste of whiskey on his lips the night before the storm. Remembered his hand on her cheek. Remembered the way he wrapped gauze around her arm after the night the killers broke through the door. Remembered the words. Maybe it was the right door. She remembered, and she allowed herself to remember because she was tired of pretending that important things weren't important. One afternoon, 3 months and 11 days after she stepped out of the Falcone Tower elevator, the flower shop was about to close. Val was sweeping the floor, her hair tied high, her apron stained with plant sap, pruning shears tucked into her back pocket, and the doorbell rang. She didn't look up right away because the bell rang all day, but then she did, and Corbin Falcone was standing in the doorway of the flower shop. No black suit, a dark blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark pants, simple shoes, no guard behind him, no black car at the curb, no visible or invisible weapon, just a 37-year-old man standing at the door of a small flower shop in a Chicago suburb in the late afternoon. And he looked different. Not different because of the clothes, but different because of his eyes. His eyes weren't cold, weren't empty, weren't flat. They held something Val needed a few seconds to recognize, because she had never seen it in him before. It was nervousness. The nervousness of a man coming to see a woman when he wasn't sure she wanted to see him. "What do you need?" Val asked, and she kept her voice steady because if she didn't, it would break. "A bouquet," Corbin said. "For whom?" "For someone I owe an apology to because I pulled her into my world," he said, then paused, looked at her, and continued more softly, "and a thank you because she pulled me out of it." Val looked at him, and she didn't cry though she wanted to, didn't smile though she wanted to. She only stood there, broom in hand, apron stained with sap, rose thorn scars on her fingers, then walked to the flower counter and chose each stem slowly, by herself, white roses, pale pink peonies, lavender, just like the vase he had placed in the penthouse on the night before the storm, because he knew she needed flowers. And she wrapped them in brown paper, tied them with twine, and brought them to him. When he reached out to take the bouquet, their fingers touched, and neither of them pulled away. And that moment wasn't a kiss, wasn't a promise, only skin against skin, warm, real, and enough. "The shop is closed," Val said, her voice small, but her eyes did not leave his. "But I know a cafe nearby, not a penthouse, no guards, just bad coffee and plastic chairs." Corbin Falcone, the man who ruled Chicago's underworld empire, the man who had stood at the top of a tower looking down at the city like a god looking down at ants, the man his younger brother had needed to fake his death to escape, and his mother had needed to lie to protect. The man who had killed with his own hands and cried alone in a wooden house in the middle of a Wisconsin field, smiled. A real smile, rare, wounded, and beautiful. A smile Val had never seen on his face during all the weeks she had lived in the penthouse. A smile not belonging to the boss but to the man, only the man, standing in a little flower shop holding a bouquet made by the woman he loved. "Lead the way," he said. Val took off her apron, hung it on the hook behind the counter, turned off the shop lights, locked the door, and stepped out onto the sidewalk with him. The Chicago evening sun poured golden-orange light over the small streets, over the fronts of the laundromat and the cafe beside the flower shop, over the familiar, cracked sidewalk she had walked across thousands of times. And there was no black car on the street, no gun, no killer, no empty coffin, no coins that needed counting, no collection call waiting for Monday morning. Only two scarred people walking side by side on the sidewalk, slowly, in no hurry, both of them, for the first time in their lives, walking without running. And if you asked Val that night whether she believed in fate, she would still say no, but she would say she believed in the wrong door, because sometimes the wrong door is the only door that leads to the right person. This story may have touched your heart in some way, and if it did, I want you to pause for 1 second and think about the lesson it leaves behind. That sometimes the strongest person isn't the one who holds on to everything, but the one who knows how to let go. That real help arrives in silence, without needing a name, without needing thanks. That scars don't make us uglier, they only show that we survived, and that no one in this world is so strong that they need no one. And no one is so weak that they can't save anyone, because sometimes the flower delivery girl with $43 in her wallet is the one who pulls the boss out of the darkness, and sometimes the mafia boss is the only one who truly sees her when the whole world looks past her. That is the most beautiful thing about being human. We heal one another by truly seeing one another. If this story made you feel something, please press the like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone you think needs to hear this story today, and subscribe to our channel so every day you can have a new story that touches the heart. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had a moment in real life when the wrong door led you to exactly where you needed to be? Leave a comment below. We read every line, and we want to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Hello, and thank you for being here until the very last minute. We wish everyone watching this video truly good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.